Thanks very much, everyone, and welcome back to this second session of our Entrenched Illiberalism in Southeast Asia conference. Really looking forward to this discussion on a panel with the theme Conservative Myanmar ? We all know that Myanmar has this past hectic decade gone through an incredible range of different transitions. There has, of course, been the political push and shove, now of course seeing the State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi in a position of some considerable authority. We have seen the stop-start process towards peace, also a stop-start process towards war. And with that, of course, a great many economic, cultural and other transformations that have washed across Myanmar society. We're joined for this session today by an absolutely stellar group of four analysts who all bring different perspectives to bear on these questions. They're going to do their very best to keep their interventions short and sharp. Those of you who've seen me chair panels over the years know that I'm not shy about intervening and keeping the conversation moving. And given the amount of content that we really want to cover over this next hour or so, I hope that you'll find this an energetic and stimulating conversation. For a conversation, of course, we're going to need all of you to do your bit as well. And so I'll be looking to the audience pretty early on, at roughly the 22-minute mark, where I will hope that you can get into this discussion, give us your perspectives, and hopefully push our four panellists when it comes to these big and often troubling questions of what has been going on in Myanmar in recent times. So what I'm going to do to provide a bit of structure to our early conversation is that I've just got one big question. The question is Myanmar conservative and does it matter? And I'm going to start by putting this question to Associate Professor Melissa Crouch from the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Melissa, as you can read in your conference program, has an outstanding track record of publications on a range of Southeast Asian legal and political topics. She started out as an Indonesia specialist, but as is the way of the world, slowly migrated towards Myanmar and has in recent times produced a unique and incredibly important contribution to our understanding of the Myanmar Constitution. So Melissa, it's always great to have you back on our campus. Thanks very much for making the trip. And let's get started. Your thoughts on the question, is Myanmar conservative and does it matter?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think that's an important question, and for me, two examples or stories came to mind in thinking about expressions of conservatism in Myanmar presently. The first was in February, earlier this year, when I was in Myanmar. I happened to be in a taxi driving downtown one weekend just after the NLD had made the announcement that it was going to start this process of considering constitutional amendment formally through Parliament. And I happened to see some sort of busloads of people with flags, and I could sort of immediately get the impression that they were going to a protest, so I sort of told my taxi driver to stop. We kind of halted. I ran back to sort of ask them what was the protest about, where were they going to? And these were essentially anti-change protesters. This was a rally organised by the military. Some of these people had been paid to go. They were bussed into downtown Yangon, but they had two flags, and I thought this was quite intriguing. One was the national flag, and I guess it stood for nationalism and in some sense anti-change, the idea that the constitution and the flag represent the status quo that gives certain privileges to the military. But the second was a symbol of a dove, symbolising the peace process. But again, it kind of struck me that this was being paired with the flag, with ideas of nationalism, and with a sense of conservatism and anti-change. The second example, which happened a year or so ago, was many of us here would be familiar with the crisis in Rakhine State, which in its second phase, August 2017, attracted significant attention from the international community, as it should. I remember one particular day, which was the day just before Aung San Suu Kyi was due to give her speech to the international community. In the end, she didn't go to the UN, but she gave a televised speech. The day before, there were, well, I think the morning as well, protests both in places like Canberra, as well as in cities across Myanmar, going under the banner of "We Stand with Daw Suu." Now, I saw many of my friends on Facebook participating in these protests and in these shows of solidarity for Aung San Suu Kyi, but essentially in favour of her position at that time in relation to the Rohingya and Rakhine State crisis. And at that time, she was very much questioning, well, we don't know why these people have left. Many people have actually stayed, and very much offering a sceptical and a view to the international community that was raising a lot of questions about the extent of this humanitarian crisis, and really, in many ways, not taking it as seriously as the international community thought that Myanmar should. So these two examples for me give some indication of the extent of conservatism in Myanmar, but I want to suggest that it's not new, and that we can see many other examples previously. In relation to these anti-constitutional change rallies, we also saw this in 2013, 2014, and so in some sense it's not necessarily new. And again, this sentiment of support for Aung San Suu Kyi and in some sense against the Rohingya is in many ways reminiscent of 2015, when although on the one hand we see the NLD win the election, we see that's at the cost of the disenfranchisement of white card holders, most of whom are the Rohingya. So in that sense, I would say conservatism is not new. Yes, it does matter, because I think in particular at this point in time, it significantly affects how Myanmar is relating and responding to the international community. And we know that there is a lot of hostility in Myanmar, a lot of anxiety about this, and a lot of rejection about the way in which the international community is trying to be involved.
Great, thanks very much, Melissa. We're off to a terrific start, and I hope that all of you out there in the audience are keeping track of the different perspectives that we're going to hear. So hopefully, after we've asked this question 4 times, we're going to have 4 somewhat different answers. And in probing those answers, we'll come to some deeper understanding of exactly what's at stake here. So, next up, same question. The question is, of course, is Myanmar conservative, and does that matter? Our second panellist is Khin Zaw Win, who, as many of you will know, was for over a decade a prisoner of conscience under Myanmar's previous military dictatorship, locked up for seditious writings and also for his human rights advocacy. Since then, he has proved an incredibly energetic and active contributor to public debate and to policy formulation within Myanmar. He currently holds a key role in one of the country's most effective organisations when it comes to getting to grips with the issues that we're discussing here today. And Saya Khin Zaw Win, it is always a great pleasure to have you back on our campus and here in Canberra. We have over the years come to cherish the relationship between our institution and yours, and we are delighted to give you this platform. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. First of all, for your kind introduction. I'm glad to be back in Canberra. Thank you for the invitation. Although it came at a little bit of short notice, I managed it. And I'm very glad to keep up this association. Now, to get to the central issue or the question, well, there is definitely a conservative streak in Myanmar, as it is in other countries in mainland Southeast Asia because of our common history and backgrounds. Well, Myanmar particularly because it's still largely agrarian, rural, and Buddhist. If you combine all these 3, it makes for a certain degree of conservatism. It doesn't mean that the ethnic nationalities are not conservative, although they are Christian, although they have different backgrounds, they are conservative too. Just look at the Rohingya issue. I mean, many of the ethnics are also opposed to that, just as the Myanmar. But if you come to this now, since independence, you could say that this, let's say, streak, let's just call it, of conservatism has persisted. And at certain times, even now, that has been made to good political use. Now, while in the days after independence, after the 70s, 80s, when Marxism and communism were very strong forces in Myanmar, this conservative, with this, let's say, tendency or inclination was put to good use by the governments. Of course, the United States aided it. You've heard of the moral rearmament movement, and that was a very potent force against communism. So it worked to their advantage. But later on, with the military regime and things like that, it became more nationalistic, more anti-foreigner, and more inward-looking. And if you have had a junta for half a century, you can imagine what the results are going to be. And that's what we are finding ourselves as. So after 1988, after the elections of 2010, there's a lot of upbeat feeling, hope that there will be liberal change, but we have been disappointed. And I think it's just bad luck. Oh, we don't know. Well, it's been simmering for a long time that the Rohingya and the Rakhine crisis erupted. And there was this upwelling of sentiment against the Rohingya, against the Muslims, against sometimes even the ethnics. So this is what conservatism works against. And this is something that we have to try and mitigate or change. I think this is a trend that you see all over, not only in Asia, but in the developing world. There are pros and cons to it. But we don't want to have people saying that, oh, we don't want these foreigners here, we want to be on ourselves. Well, China's next door, and they're rolling the Belt and Road out. Globalization is there. Many Myanmar people are going elsewhere to work. So how well will this conservatism sit with our present circumstances and for our future? So this is something that we have to grapple with. I was just back on Mandalay. Mandalay has changed a lot. If you go to the rural areas, you still find that. So is this something that we should preserve or something that we should try and change? Well, there are certain elements that we would like to preserve, but all in all, I think it is also the job of leadership to try and work on this. You just can't wait in those halls in Naypyidaw for the next election, for the next votes. By the way, the opening panel was really sparkling. But elections are not everything. So if you just regard the people and the public as just an electorate and just vote banks, it's not going to work. The job of leadership is to try to change perceptions. I think that goes for conservatism too.
Thank you very much, Zaw. And again, a short, sharp appraisal of what's at stake here in Myanmar, not just now, but going back deep into the country's historical circumstances. Next up, our third speaker, who doesn't need an introduction, partly because he received one earlier today, and partly, of course, because he's very familiar to those of us who focus on Myanmar here at the ANU. Chit Win received his PhD a couple of years ago from the Department of Political and Social Change, and he has now returned to Naypyidaw, where he has resumed his career as a diplomat, but has in recent times been associated with the Office of the National Security Advisor. I know from all of the conversations that Chit Win and I have shared over the past decade or so that you have views on this topic and on this question. You have views about what will be in Myanmar's best interests for the long term. So, Dr. Chit Win, is Myanmar conservative and does it matter?
Right, so thank you very much, Nick, for having me here. It's not our first time to be in the same panel where you chaired the chair, and during my PhD candidacy, whenever I'm with Nick chairing the panel, I always have a second thought, in answering some of the questions you raised, because ultimately, my thesis is still there, not yet approved by him. But this time, no stress. Well, Nick, to answer your question, it depends on who you ask. So my daughter was here this morning. If I ask her whether Myanmar is conservative, she would say yes, definitely. And she would say because whenever she goes to, Shudagong Pagoda, with skirts, short skirts. She always has to wear what we call the longi of shame. Not appropriate, so she has to wear the longi that is provided by the pagoda trustee and everyone looks at it. They know that this is the lady who comes to the pagoda with an inappropriate dress, has to change. To her, it's conservative. But if you ask my wife whether Myanmar is conservative, and she would definitely say no, because a lot of the women these days are wearing whatever they want. Extramarital marriage is now, a day-to-day practice. Doesn't matter, living together, it's nobody cares. So to her, I think Myanmar it's not a conservative society. So, but as Melissa mentioned, conservative, I think some of the key words taken from her can be change, anti, opposition to the change. So we need to look at whether Myanmar is opposed to the change. So my argument is that yes, Myanmar is sometimes against to the changes. And because those changes are dramatic, out of control of those people, and sometimes perceived as a threat. And therefore, it is a reaction to the change, a drastic change. So if you look at some of the recent events, such as 1988 uprising, some of the events that leads to military control of the country and the opposition, and also the case in Rakhine, as you mentioned. So these are a reaction to some of the drastic changes, be it local or be it foreign. And another thing is that our society, unfortunately, in my opinion, still live in the past. So when we talk to each other, and I think Khin Zaw Win, you will agree, when we talk to the parents, they will always talk the glorious days of their past. And when we also talk to my kids, we will always talk to our glorious days, what has happened, not like what will happen in the future. So we always tend to go back and yawning the past glory. And in my opinion, and this is what makes Myanmar conservative. But what makes Myanmar not conservative is that if you look at the history again, how our costume has developed. We have taken our coat, the taekbon, from the Chinese. The longi tends to come from the South Asia. So if you look at it, it is, and also the stiff collar from Thai and so on. So we have adapted. The society was able to adapt successfully. So it depends, like I said, it depends on who you ask, the changes to the drastic reaction to the change. Now, whether it does matter, is that to answer is yes. And especially for those people sitting in Canberra, whether Myanmar is conservative, to me, it's important because Myanmar currently is under tremendous pressure, both domestic and foreign. And when you look at the foreign pressure, we have the international community is pressing Myanmar in the case of Rakhine, the peace process, democratic transition. And if the international pressure keeps to at one point where Myanmar has no choice but to make a reaction, and I think it has no choice, like Khin Zaw Win said, it will turn against to our neighbors in the east, and where its Belt and Road Initiative is coming with huge force. So Myanmar has always wanted to put its eggs in different baskets. But pressuring all these without international understanding how Myanmar becomes conservative or not conservative, and I think will influence Myanmar in putting its egg in which basket. And depending on which it put in its basket will affect in turn the whole Belt and Road Initiative, and in turn, I think, redefine all of Asia. And as Asia is now being redefined between Indo-Pacific strategy and Belt and Road Initiative, and I think it is folks in Canberra, how to treat the conservatism in Myanmar, I think becomes more relevant.
Thank you very much, Chip Wynn. And for those of you who've never had many opportunities to see Chip Win in full flight, you will come to know that he loves a good metaphor or analogy. And I was sitting here and waiting, and he'd been talking for 4 minutes and he hadn't got to one yet. And then he gave us the eggs in the basket. So thank you very much, Chit Win, for providing an illustration, a memorable one in this case, of exactly what it might mean to be working more effectively with some of the conservative interests in Myanmar today. So thank you very much. And now finally, our fourth panellist is Dr. Costas Laoutides, who is a senior lecturer down at Deakin University, where his work focuses on separatist conflicts, particularly in Asia, and the mechanisms for their prospective resolution. Costas is very widely published, but I'd like to draw particular attention to his newest book, published by Hurst and Oxford University Press, a co-authored piece with Anthony Ware, and it is focused very directly on Myanmar's current Rohingya conflict and the crisis that continues to roll out of the Myanmar-Bangladesh borderlands. Costas, it's great to have you here at the ANU. Thanks very much for joining us. And now to the question, I'll say it one last time. Is Myanmar conservative, and does it matter?
Thank you very much, Nick. Very glad to be here among distinguished guests and an excellent audience. I think that I need to speak through my personal experience during field work when we were putting together with Anthony that book. And one quite startling and striking aspect of my experience was that we were going to talk and interview elite figures from all ethnic groups, not just from the Burmese or the Rohingya, but from all ethnic groups. We were asking them questions about human rights, we were asking them questions about ethnic diversity and so on and so forth. The majority of them very progressive, very liberal in their thinking, defenders of human rights, defenders of progress, political change, economic change for the country, improvement of the well-being of the population, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly, when we had to ask about the Rohingya, there was a pause. They didn't want to talk about it. Then they were retracting the conversation about human rights, about to what extent we can extend human rights to all inhabitants of Myanmar, to all those people who live in Myanmar. In some other cases, we had to talk to politicians, but the proviso was no discussion about the Rohingya. Otherwise, there was no interview. At the same time, however, so that gave us the impression that we're talking about an illiberal, if you like, sentiment within a liberal trend that has been happening in Myanmar. And this is an evolving process, not something static, and I don't want to capture everyone in Myanmar along these lines, but this is what I experienced, along with Anthony. But then, a few years, we started back in 2014, so a few years later on, after 2017, after the exodus, we are back in Myanmar, and we literally come across a number of youth groups, both in Chit Win and in Yangon. In Yangon, there were Bama ethnically, who ran pages on Facebook where they use the term Rohingya. They don't have any problem with that. Their main focus is not what is going to happen with the Rohingya or whether they have a legitimate name or not, but they're interested in the political development and the political progress of the country as a country. Which makes me think that you experience a transition in all aspects of the society. There are challenges and, if you like, disagreements between the youth and the elites. So it's very difficult to brand Myanmar as a conservative or a non-conservative in a single stride. This is very difficult. But what we can say is that there is an element of progress, especially among the youth. There is resistance to that. Partly this conservative or illiberalism, if you like, could be associated with what Chit Win talked about, the nation-building process in the previous session. And especially if we think that this nation-building process is based on an organic understanding of nation, where the priority is on the ethnic identity and the relation between the citizen and the state relies on who that person is, not what they contribute to the society. So what they are ethnically. So this organic understanding of nation building and the idea that there is, if you like, a very long historical process of homogenizing the population. That takes place along static ethnic lines. Now, does this matter? Yes, it does matter, whether it is conservative or not, because the way that this nation building evolves, it will have an impact on the transition process. And the way that Myanmar is going to see itself as a demos. So we talk about democracy this morning, and the subject matter of democracy is the demos. So who is the demos? Who is the people that is looking for representation? And I think I'm going to leave it there and just open up the floor for questions.
Great, thank you very much to Costas for those very astute points. We've got 4 reflections in response to this question, and we've also got plenty of time now to drill down into this. What I'm proposing to do is to ensure that this conversation flows backwards and forwards from our panellists to all of you. I'm going to chime in at various stages with my own questions and provocations for the panellists, but I'd just like to see if there are any of you who'd like to jump in at this early stage and put any questions to our panellists. I've already got a couple of hands up, so we might go to you towards the back in the middle, and then we'll come down here to John and then over to Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Dominic. I'm a student at the College of Asia Pacific. I just wanted to follow on from Costas' point about young people in Myanmar and maybe ask some of the other panelists what the role of these young people and youth-led movements are in answering this question whether Myanmar is conservative. If we look at like student unions, like Africa, they're not traditionally conservative, or perhaps they are. Do they have a role, and are they successful in shaping how we view Myanmar?
Great, thanks very much, Dominic. Let's take that question first. Who'd like to jump straight in?
Yeah.
Khin Zaw Win.
Well, good, because you see this not only in Myanmar but in other countries too. What I said this morning about the Thai Youth Party, Future Forward, is very exciting, I would say. Well, thank you very much for bringing all these strands together, because I've been seeing news reports about Future Forward and about its leader who is now being, watched and harassed. I think a similar trend in Myanmar is happening. We still have 1.5 years till the 2020 elections. There is still the possibility of a youth party, because the people that I work with, not only in the universities, but young people, they are very disenchanted with not only certain major political parties, but with the whole party system as a whole. I think we see this in other countries too, but in Myanmar it's definitely happening. And just last week, 26 motorcycles and 62 people, 2 young people on each motorbike. They had peace flags, and they had a 1,500-mile journey to all the regions of Myanmar, showing, let's say, the peace flag. I mean, this is very exciting, and they even went to some of the conflict areas in Shan State, and this is their own initiative, So we are seeing this emerging youth-led initiatives, and I think this is going to have a definite impact on 2020. We just talk about 2020, And in other walks of life too, well, there are the punk singers, who are making these anti-war songs, sometimes using, sometimes rather racy language, but it really gets to people, saying that, okay, we have an alternative now. We just don't have to listen to these old leaders saying blah, 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 blah. Listen, look at Myanmar. The government and much of the political party leadership is a gerontocracy. I'm not against the senior citizens, but if you have a democracy or a political movement that's just led by that senior segments of society, you are not going to make much inroads. And there is no connect with the youth, I'm in that generation too, but I'm open to the youth. I have a mentoring program with Mainland University. It's very vibrant. So we are definitely seeing that trend and that process of change in Myanmar. And I'm all for it.
Great. Thank you, Saya. Other thoughts?
Maybe I'll just add on a slightly different note to say, for me, one step towards a real change in Myanmar would be to allow student unions. My understanding is that since the political transition, while unions are allowed generally, student unions are still not allowed. And that's for a very deliberate and explicit reason. We know that students and student unions in the past, in Myanmar's history, have been critical to times of political change and opposition. Under colonial rule, under socialist rule, under military rule, it was often students who were leading, the charge for change and opposing the current regime. And still at the moment we don't have that official. Student unions are not officially allowed to form, although, as Khin Zaw Win has said, there are students doing things here and there trying to contribute to change. But to me, that would be one change that the NLD could make if it wanted to, that would bring about a renewed sense of civil society mobilisation in Myanmar.
Can I add a small point? There's been a small development recently. I'm going to let you know about it. In one way, they are emerging, and they are very left-wing. I can tell you that. And the present leadership is much opposed to that. So this is like going back to the 50s and 60s, when the student movement was very strong, and they had definitely very strong links with the Burma Communist Party, which was outlawed. But surprisingly, things have happened, and I know this because I was there. Last year or the year before that was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, and it was held in Yangon University, and I said, wonder of wonders, oh my goodness, what's happening now? And I went there, it was not very well attended, and they had a banner there with the emblems of these student unions, and many of them had hammers and sickles on them, red stars, peacock emblems. So it's emerging. I went to some of the functions, very small attendance, but you can see the kind of people, like in the 50s, long hair, thick spectacles, who read a lot, and they quote Das Kapital. But it's happening. So in a way, that's a liberalizing trend. And let me say now, in Yadamong University, which is the second university in Mandalay, there was a protest against the chief minister, and they burnt not only an effigy, but a coffin with his name. So they were arrested, and they were jailed for about 6 months, and they were beaten in prison. So, what I'm saying is that you can't stop these trends from emerging. Well, okay, if they are extreme left-wing, that's up to them. I don't think there's much of a following, to be very frank. But if the authorities react in this way, in this very ham-fisted way, they are making a mistake.
Thank you, Saya. Chip Wynn, your reflections?
Right. I think before I answer to his question, probably maybe I want to reflect some of the points that Costas has mentioned. He mentioned about this nation building, the notion of the nation, ethnic identity, who is in and who is out, and with that, international community, when looking at Myanmar, and mostly these days looks at Myanmar through the prism of this Rakhine issue, and for us, back in the capital, we try to mention to all the international community that the Rakhine issue is not the only issue in Myanmar. We have other important serious issues to address. So I think the Rakhine issue is one of the sensitive issues, and with that, Myanmar has been increasingly looked at it that Myanmar is conservative because of by looking at the case of Rakhine. But things in Myanmar are changing, and the youth are I think the answer to these Rakhine problem, because the elder generation, when we look at these problem in Rakhine, we always look at the ethnic identity, the nation building, the nationalism involved, the struggle against colonialism. All these have been compounded. The next generation has just a vivid idea through the textbooks of what has happened in the past. for the youth, when you ask some of the, say, people in the city boys or city girls, what do you want to become? They just want to get out of Myanmar as much as possible, either become a migrant worker or study abroad. If you ask to someone, say, people from Pa'o region, what do you want to become, to the boys? They will answer two things, either the monk or the soldiers, which means authority. Monk is also a moral authority. The soldier who holds the gun, also the authority. So, the ethnic groups. And also to the girls, what do they want to become? I went to those ethnic areas, and mostly the answer, they want to become teachers, a respectable person in their village. So also, I think the youth, I think depending on their region, I think also have their different perception. But one thing that we can use is that the youth, because they didn't suffer, all these turmoils in the history of Myanmar, and I think youth, are the promise of the future, and also in solving the case of Rakhine. But they've been compounded with the pressures from the elders, the status quo, who want to hold the status quo. So again, if I may make just analogy, is that me, receiving my daughter's boyfriend, as soon as I saw him, rejection, why you bring this boy here, and without all of a sudden he pops up. But as time goes by, you have to no choice but to accept him, and you have to live with him, and you make all the adjustment. And likewise in Myanmar, and I think what you are seeing now, even though the international community see through the Rakhine case, Myanmar tends to be conservative, and I think we are also adjusting ourselves to the realities. And I think in the years to come, with the youth becoming adults, Myanmar will adjust itself to live side by side. I think especially in the case of Rakhine, and also with other ethnic communities.
Great. Thank you, Chit Win. Any quick comments from you, Costas?
Very quickly, I think, as I said, what I have witnessed is these youth groups being active and try to bring new, fresh ideas about how to organize politically and how to move on. And because there has been a lot of Facebook bashing over the past 2 years, I think that we need to highlight, in order to be fair, that because of Facebook and the social media as well, there is interconnectivity between these youth, which is important. So sometimes we see Facebook or the internet as the cause of the problem. It may contribute through wrongful use to the problem, but definitely it's not the root. And the very way that Facebook is used in a positive fashion from the youth to get organized and try to voice their difference is it's a very good example of that.
Great. Thanks, Costas. Next question, John.
Thanks, Nick. And look, this leads on from what we've just been talking about. When we look at the issue in Rakhine State of the Rohingya challenge, I wonder if there is an appreciation inside Myanmar of just how toxic that is to Myanmar's reputation. Is there an appreciation of just how completely undermining the goodwill towards Myanmar that was there with the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi only a handful of years ago? And is there a recognition that this is seen as not just a problem for Myanmar and Bangladesh, but a regional problem, in part because of the experience only a few years ago when many got on boats and created all sorts of governance problems across maritime Southeast Asia, and the concerns that might still be the case. One of the things that strikes me about the road to democracy of Myanmar is that it was partly to make ASEAN work more effectively. Apart from wanting to lift sanctions, was to make ASEAN work more effectively. And yet these actions seem to have undermined ASEAN. There's so much opposition from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and elsewhere for what's happened there. Is there an awareness of what's going on? Is there an awareness of how the international community feels about this? Is there an appreciation of the consequence of these decisions? And so beyond that, then is there a sense that inside Myanmar there's any real plan of action, a genuine plan of action to address the concerns of the Rohingya, and is there a concern to address the concerns of the international community? And beyond that, is there a chance that a coalition of countries can actually help Myanmar? I mean, there's a lot of goodwill towards Myanmar that doesn't seem to have been capitalised on by the government in Nairobi. There's a real kind of blind spot to how much countries want to help, Australia included, and Indonesia and others that actually have goodwill, Thailand and others, fellow Theravada Buddhist countries and others that want to play, and yet they seem to be stymied by Myanmar. So I appreciate the panel's perspectives on that.
Great, thanks very much. And that's Professor John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, where he is the head, and he's also director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute, for those of you who don't know John. So I can see other hands going up. I think you'd all agree, though, that this is a question that we all want to hear some responses to. So let's bustle through the panel. Who'd like to go first? Khin Zaw Win.
I totally agree with you, but it's a very personal decision. I'm in a very much a minority. I speak out on this issue a lot. I've lost friends because of that, and I use what is called the R word openly. Last year, I made a record 4 trips to Delhi, twice on the Rohingya and twice on regional security. Okay, now, the thing is that this plays very much into the question that you've asked, how conservative Myanmar is. Just last week, there was a scholar from a Berlin think tank, and I took them to Mandalay. It was in a closed session, it's not closed door. But 2 civil society representatives from Mandalay said that, oh, we are very close about EU-Myanmar relations, and of course, oh, we are very cognizant. We realize the EU is concerned. But this is an issue that we cannot speak on publicly. They said privately you can, but if you speak on this publicly, there could be a backlash, and you could lose, there could be, disruptions in your relationships. So that is the degree of conservatism. Maybe you might not want to regard me as, the rule. I'm very much an exception. I admit that, But this has to change, and that's what I meant when I talked about political leadership, And this is something that you just can't ignore, sweep under the carpet, dismiss. That is exactly what's happening. ASEAN is split on this because we have 2 populous Muslim countries there. Indonesia is trying to do a lot. Now, there's been a lot of interactions with our neighboring countries, Well, of course, our big neighbors, India, China, Thailand, and of course, other countries. But these 3 countries have their own problems with the Muslim minorities. In India, look what Modi is doing to the Muslims. China with the Uyghurs, Xinjiang. Thailand has its problems in the south. So they're keeping their hands off on Myanmar's Rohingya issue. So because they have their own interests, So maybe ASEAN might not be able to do enough. Well, again on Friday, just before I came here, I was interviewed on Burmese media. I said some very strong things. And if you want, you can analyze the responses to it. The conservative streak is still there. There's a lot of work waiting for someone who wants to change this country, but that kind of thing has to come. Just to put it in a nutshell, what I said was, you have to engage with the international community and with the international bodies, otherwise Myanmar is going to go downhill very fast. And sometimes it has to be said in plain language because no one else is saying it. Very few people are saying it. I mean, I hope that answers your question. It's of deep concern to me. But again, I'm just almost in a minority voice on this.
Thank you, Saya. Other thoughts?
Thank you, John, for your question. I think we have to address this elephant in the room. Actually, it's not an elephant, it's a bull in the room. Just, Nick, I just can't, even though I came here, without wearing any hat, I just can't hide my head, I think the audience need to understand, deserve to know that, Myanmar acknowledges the issue, the problem issue that existed in Rakhine State in the case of these people, the Muslims in Rakhine, and the exodus in Bangladesh. And to that end, we have established a lot of mechanisms to deal with that, both bilaterally with Bangladesh, well, regionally in the context of ASEAN and through the using the good offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Here comes the problem. The problem is that all the countries involved, Myanmar, Bangladesh, the international community, ASEAN, they're driven by the self-interest. So in Naypyidaw, we feel that some of the countries are using these issues to advance their self-interest. So be it ASEAN or be it Bangladesh or any other country. So this is and when you look at it, because coming from a field, I serve as a liaison to the Professor Surakiat's Committee on Advisory Group for this issue, and also I'm a member of the joint task force with Myanmar and Bangladesh for the repatriation. So I went to the field. So I feel the complexity in what is happening on the ground and some of the misunderstanding that is happening in the respective headquarters. So when I talk with the people, the diplomats in Yangon, they understand the complexity of what is going on in Rakhine State. Likewise, the capital, they sense some of the complexity, but they are under pressure through their constituencies, the government, because of the international media portrayal of this Rakhine issue. So the governments, the capitals are under tremendous pressure from their constituencies to pressure Myanmar for the case of Rakhine, and their respective foreign ministry have no choice but to ask their embassies in Yangon in turn to pressure the government. So there's been when you ask some of the heads of missions in Yangon, the diplomats, they understand on one hand the complexity of Rakhine issue, and on the other hand, their directives asking them to put pressure on Myanmar. So this is what is going on in the political level. When it comes to on the ground, I really see the humanitarian, the disaster there, and that Myanmar government is overwhelmed in taking all these measures in the humanitarian assistance. For example, when it comes to repatriation of these more than almost 1 million people from Bangladesh, I'm sure Myanmar has no way resources to receive all of them back. So I think we have to look for the international assistance. But again, when we look for the international assistance, the international community put some of the benchmarks, and that making Myanmar more difficult. And then when we try to engage bilaterally with the Bangladeshi, we ask the return of the first batches of the returnees, say the Hindus, minorities. The Bangladeshi authorities refuse to do so. So these are some of the problems on the ground. So we want to have a first batch of returnees to taken place so that it accelerates, so it can create a momentum for the repatriation process. But again, we're being compounded these kinds of trouble. The Bangladeshi, because of their election, they want to be seen, they want to use these issues as for the electoral purposes. So these are some of the complexities, what is going on the ground and as well as in the respective capitals. Setting aside that, I think as times goes by, the Myanmar government really realized the international pressure, the real problem that is existed on the ground, and make genuine efforts to change the scenario. But again, the Myanmar government has entered into another challenge, which is the Arakan army. The AA it's like a step in the back. So we'll have to see what's going on in the future with the AA.
Chip Wynn. Melissa.
Yeah, just briefly on the awareness point, I'm I've been struck in the past 2 years, particularly how often I get asked why the international community is so concerned about Rakhine State and the Rohingya crisis by people in Myanmar. But I think often it comes from a concern around the economic consequences. I think people in Myanmar are very aware of the economic impacts that this has had on the country in terms of decline in Western interest in foreign investment, Western tourism, and that impact on the economy more broadly. But to me, there is a lack of the humanitarian consciousness of the humanitarian implications of this, and I think this kind of goes to the heart of the illiberalism that we're talking about here, in the sense that it's an illiberalism that denies the dignity and liberty of individuals, whoever they might be. I think the one point of leverage that the international community might still have, that I'm not entirely sure that it's aware of and that's coming up, is the elections, the 2020 elections. We heard in the panel this morning that Myanmar very much wants to show another free and fair election. And I think we could say that from both sides, whether it's the NLD, the USDP, the military. I mean, they want to ensure that this next election can also be considered free and fair. We've heard that the international community played a big role in 2015 in election monitoring and so on. And so I think there are some really big questions that the international community has to ask itself about whether and how it will engage with Myanmar authorities in the lead up to the 2020 elections. Will there be elections in Rakhine State and in northern Rakhine State in particular? I think that is a moral dilemma, but also a dilemma that the international community could use in a way, in some way, in terms of leverage in Myanmar on this issue, and perhaps the only last modicum of leverage left.
Costas, any quick thoughts?
Yes, very quickly. There are moderate voices who are thinking differently, but they are a minority, even within the echelons of government, widely speaking. They try to influence thinking, but I think, I suspect that it is so embedded, the idea about the other with capital O. And it comes time and again, every time that we need to speak about that, and we had to be introduced in a very long national narrative instead of what happened 150 years ago, and we had to cover all these 150 years until we started doing the interview, really, which meant that we had to spend an hour only on that before getting into the interview. And that indicates how deeply entrenched that is in their thinking. So they don't see it as something toxic in the sense that we see it from the outside. It's probably, if you like, beyond rationality. It's beyond rational thinking, really. It has to do with their existence. It is an existential question for them. And when it is translated as an existential question, then your scope and the array of options that you may have to deal with it limits down. There is another minor dimension to that. What is happening now with the AA, actually, both to me and Anthony, because we've been talking about that, is that it's really rare what happens altogether in Myanmar when you have the central government dealing with a number of ethnic conflicts, including Rakhine, but not only in Rakhine. Therefore, they are part of the conflicts because they actively are involved in that conflict, yeah? Using armed forces, including. And at the same time, they try to portray themselves as the mediators. Now, honestly, I've been working on conflict theory for the past 25 years. I haven't seen something similar in another geographical context. I have worked in Bosnia and Kosovo with the Kurds. Hardly I have seen the case of a state who wanted to portray itself as the mediator to a conflict in which they are part. That doesn't match with mediation theory altogether. So the mediator must be an impartial entity which at least doesn't have any active involvement to the conflict at hand. Here we have that, do you want to call it paradox? Do you want to call it oxymoron? that's fine by me. But it is quite striking, this confidence that they can do it, it is possible to do it, it is possible to happen, and the confidence that they can bring change through that. And I leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Costas. Next question, Paul.
Thanks very much. I would like to take a couple of points from the last panel and throw them in for consideration here. First point came early on in the last panel from Chit Win, in which he highlighted that in his view, the entrenchment of illiberalism is part of building a nation. And then at the very end of the panel, Rajak highlighted the degree to which official nationalist discourses continue to be dominant in Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. So I wanted to ask the panel their perspectives on a big question, I admit. What is the vision of the nation and nation building? And if it is a conservative official nationalism, what opportunities might there be in the future to have an evolving new sense of nation and nation building? Thank you.
Would you like to start first this time?
All right. Thank you. It's a very pertinent question. If I would just go back to the American Civil War, well, you could argue along that point that they had to use illiberalism to keep the country together. In fact, fight a civil war. But in the sense of mainland Southeast Asia, if you're going to use force, and more force to build a nation, it is not going to work. Just what is happening in Rakhine and with the Arakan army, the Myanmar military is using free fire zones against Rakhine villages. This is the Vietnam War being replayed again. Helicopter gunships, they think it's a new military technology. It is not going to work, and the sooner the people in Nigeria realize this, the civil and the military, the better it is. Well, in certain situations, you might have, if you are really forward-thinking, maybe the British Empire was made that way to use force and illiberalism to keep something together. But it's a very big risk, and let me say, with the kind of resources that Myanmar has, and it's been going on for 70 years, we are not going to have a nation built that way. Let me tell you very frankly, now we had elections in 2010, we had elections in 2015, and then there was a peace process that started in 2011. Things have unraveled even more since then. There's more mistrust. At least two ethnicities are talking about breaking away. My very good Kachin friends are talking about independence. The Rakhine Arakan army is talking about confederation. There's anathema to the military. So there is much more polarization than before. And like I said, force and repeated force will not solve it. So I don't agree that illiberalism is useful in state building or in nation building.
Thank you, Khin Zaw Win. Any other quick comments from the panel?
I think maybe I'll take Paul's remarks. Yes, I mentioned in the previous panel that this illiberalism is part of the nation building process. And like I said in the first panel, if you look at the history in the context of Myanmar, in the history, the nation building process was disrupted through this colonization. So before colonization, what was happening with the Burma at that time is that you will see the Shans and the Burmans are becoming, closer. The Kachins and the Shans are becoming also closer. So there's a kind of a nation-building process with Ava Kingdom becoming strong, central, and trying to unite all these neighboring states such as like Kachin and Rakhine and so on. So this process has been disrupted, and that we left with. How do I put it, in despair with the Kachin had its own identity, Shan, Rakhine, all these, and they're all put together in one state and gained independence from the British in the 1948 with all the unsolved problems. And I think we've been solving these issues until now. The Rakhine, the Muslim issue is one part of all these things. So I think the nation building, I think the dreams of the nation building for the Burman, I think has different stages. During the pre-colonial times, it's probably the one Burma identity with one strong central capital, probably the ideal dreams of the kings of Ava. And when it comes to after the independence, we try to look for ideology, and I think the socialism come into existence, and I think the General Zaw Win, using the socialism as a guidance, try to build the Burma at that time, and try to legitimize these through promotion of nationalism. And I think these things are the side effect, what is really having impact until today. But for now, the military, the government, and I am sure the ethnic community, some of the common dreams is that separating the Myanmar, I think it can be very drastic, and it can be very chaotic. So a kind of a federal union where the ethnic states will have more rights, and probably is the more feasible and ideal dream for the coming decades.
Thanks very much, Chit Win. So before we go quickly to Costas and then to Melissa for their comments on this question of nation building and what that means in these specific circumstances, I'd just like to let you all know what my plans are for the final 20 minutes. So we are going to gallop through, I hope, around half a dozen directed questions. It would be great if the next round of questions are directed to an individual panellist. You understand their perspectives by this point. So let's try and have some targeted questions. Think about them now in about 3 minutes. You've got 90 seconds each. I'm going to go to the audience. I'd like at least half a dozen directed questions, and which will give us some momentum through this final sprint towards the lunch break. So firstly, Costas, on Paul's question about nation building.
Well, if you ask, it's not a question, to me, it's not a question of nation building, and that doesn't concern only Myanmar. It's a global discussion. It's a global issue. It's the question of how to put together a political community which feels itself as a political community that legitimizes in turn political rule. To rely on an idea of nation which has, along with it, issues about who you are, what kind of color you have, etc., ascriptive criteria, if you like. I don't think it's the right way to move on. Even if we want to term it nation, it is a loose understanding of nation and more of a demos, more of a political community that comes together. In other geographical contexts, nation building efforts have failed, especially if it were through iron fist. There is historical evidence that iron fist doesn't work. It always generates resistance and sometimes autonomy or maybe secession. It's counterproductive altogether. And in this very complex ethnic terrain, like in Myanmar, I don't think that try to force from top to bottom any coherent or unique or concrete national image is going to facilitate the process at all.
Thank you, Costas. Finally, Melissa.
Yes, so I don't think nation building necessarily has to be majority rule, but very often, as you pointed out, that's what it descends into. And I think the added complexity in Myanmar is that you not only have sort of an official set of majority-minority groups, but then these kind of other unofficial, more invisible minorities in terms of Rohingya and other groups that are not recognised by official kinds of classification. And so I think we see this idea of nation building in terms of majority rule as an expression of some of the angst in Myanmar around what Arjun Appaduraj has called the fear of small numbers. This kind of puzzle of why is it that majorities are so concerned about small numbers of minority groups, and he explains it in terms of this sort of distortion in nation building and the nation state, and this idea that it's supposed to be about majority rule. And I think that's where we come back to the idea of liberalism and liberal democracy, in the sense that liberal democracy we use as a term against democracy simply being majority rule.
Thanks Thanks very much, Melissa. So, am I going to get half a dozen directed questions now? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm doing well. We'll keep this to 7. What we're going to do is, so you'll need to be on your toes here because they're going to come as a batch and the questions will be directed and we'll start up the back.
My name is Khin Zaw Win. I'm an undergraduate student doing the Bachelor of Asian Studies here at ANU. My question is for Dr. Khin Zaw Win. One of the changes in the last couple of years has been the rise of illiberalism in Western countries. So if you look at something like the refugee policies of Australia, the idea of Brexit with England, the election of President Donald Trump and his border policies in America, there's been a significant shift in Western countries in the way that Western countries are dealing with the idea of the other and the refugee and immigration policies that some very important Western countries that have had a very important interest in Myanmar have changed our policies. So personally, I think this has made our policies much less attractive and much less interesting to the Burmese, and could you give some perspective on that?
Right, thanks very much, Fiona. Next question. Yes?
Hello, this is Yetta Tisam from Enlightened Myanmar Research Foundation. My question is for Chip Wynn. As a person who was born and raised in Myanmar, I understand what you mean about the degrees of conservativeness and adaptations of Myanmar. One and how it is Myanmar is conservative, and one and how Myanmar is adaptive. And I have agreed some of your points, but I still have questions in my mind. Is yes, Myanmar are quite adaptive for international norms such as human rights and democracy, and this is also the reasons why we have 88 uprisings, and we can also topple the military authoritarianism, and this is also the reasons why Aung San Suu Kyi gains popularity and popular support, and now why she's on the stage of the political arena, right? But I'm now wondering when we reach to the points to the affairs in Rakhine, and why we Myanmar cannot be adaptive to international norms of human rights, and why our human rights norms are receded on that point. This is my questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And now over this side with Trevor.
I'm Trevor Wilson. I'm a visiting fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change, and I was an Australian ambassador in Myanmar a long time ago. I just wanted to make a comment on this is rather surprising to me point about the need and the value of student associations and free students associations in Myanmar. I went to an event here at the ANU recently, which is a party political event organised by the National Tertiary Education Union in Australia, and they made the point that the maintenance of free student unionism in Australia over the last decade or so, when it's been debated, was incredibly important in maintaining and supporting the ideas of liberalism in Australia. They made this point. This has nothing to do with Myanmar, but you making your comment, Melissa, made me think that maybe the role of universities in Myanmar, that was the topic of the meeting, the role of universities in Australia,
down the front. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Ajahn.
I ask Chit Win again. In relation to the issue of the conservative view, because I think the issue of the conservative here is also related to the structural condition. Will the issues that, for example, the special marriage law, which is that you have to ask permission if you have the cross relations marriage. I think this is also related to part of the conflict in Rakhine with the Rakhine Buddhists and the Muslim, and it's expand to other country. To other situations in the country. In that case, will the government or will the parliament aim to change any structural condition or legal condition that to reduce so-called the structural conservative that makes Myanmar being in that level? The second thing is why nobody blames the military, the government law, if we're talking about the Rakhine issue. It seems to me to be fair to Suu Kyi government. This is not the first time that the Rohingya has been, expelled out of the country. It's already 3 times, 2 times during the military, the dictatorship, and another 1 time, with the conflict during Khin Zaw Win. But why? The situation is just come only from this government.
Okay, thank you. And now I had 3 more hands that went up. Yes, please, Ajahn.
I'd like to ask Chit Win. My name is Pasu Pongpaichit from Chulalongkorn University. In relation to this idea of nation building, I'd like to hear some view on what the role of the business groups in Myanmar and how do they contribute to this issue of conservatism and nation building.
Great. Thank you very much, Pasu. Greg?
Greg Ratton from Bell School here at ANU. I just wonder if I can ask Khin Zaw Win if you could take us back to the events of August 2017. In my understanding, that was a time when Kofi Annan had done a lot of work on a potential program to address the root causes of the societal conflict around the Rakhine state. He came up with a report which had very detailed blueprint recommendations for security sector reform, local governments and so forth. And then that plan was blown to smithereens by the violence which took place in August 24, the attacks on the police stations by the Arakan Salvation Rohingya Army, and then the massive response from the Datmadaw. Were there vested interests at work there in ensuring that peace process, whatever program Kofi Annan put in place, would never see the light of day? Were vested interests involved in making sure that now all the actors are locked into positions from which it's very hard to retreat? I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, Greg. And now down the back to Nick.
Costas, in Holiday and Robert David, in their book on liberalism and democracy in Myanmar, characterised the country today as a limited liberal arrangement. And a couple of the reasons they say that is that it's tolerant in some respects, but not in others. Tolerant of Christians, but not of Muslims. People are enthusiastic about democracy, but they're also supportive of the military, including in the context of the violence in the Khin state, we've just been hearing about, but also in the Shan state, Khin state, where the civil war is continuing. I'd like your views on their interpretation of the agreement this week.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. And a quick time check. I've got 7 minutes on the clock, 7 minutes standing between us and the lunch buffet. Thank you, Chip Win. Yes. We can hopefully sprint through to the end here, giving each of our 4 panellists a chance to respond to those terrific final questions. Each of our panellists have at least 1 question, but please do feel free to offer other thoughts. Keep this concise, if you possibly can. But if you don't mind, Chit Win, because you have 1, 2, 3 questions to respond to, we might start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamyatesa, for your question. Your question is why Myanmar cannot adapt international pressure. In my opinion, Myanmar is adapting this international pressure in its own way. But the problem is that the international pressure or the international recommendation comes with a stick. If you don't do this, you will have this. And if you look at the history of Myanmar, you know, our bottom line is the red line is the losing our sovereignty. The territory is our bottom line. So with the international recommendation and the implementation process, it comes with a series of mechanisms that Naypyidaw feels that the sovereignty has been compromised. If you go through, if you run through all these mechanisms, and this is the part of the problem. And the other one, as I mentioned before in this panel, is the all the stakeholders are using or exploiting this issue for their self-interest. So this, I think, this is the problem with the Myanmar in adapting the international pressure. And with regards to your question, why not blame the military in the Rakhine case, is that, you know, it was so obvious that, you know, for when Daw Htay came into power, you know, people expected that, you know, she as a democratic icon will solve all these, you know, issues all on the table. But it turns out that she can't. So therefore, she has to proceed her own way, and the international community became impatient, and and also at the same time, Myanmar has to face more serious challenges. In doing so, the world became impatient with the Aung San Suu Kyi democratic icon, and the media started to label, you know, and labeling her, you know, as falling from grace, and so the media use her and they sensationalize it. So therefore, all these the accountability of the military has, I think, Daw San Suu Kyi superseded all these accountability of the military. So this, I think, this is what happened in the case of military. And when it comes to the nation building and the role of the business groups, yes, definitely the business groups played a very important role in Myanmar. And also, if you look at Myanmar business groups, you will see that a significant number of business tycoons in Myanmar are Muslims, Chinese, or ethnics. So, and they play, I think, quite a important role in Myanmar. And they do have also their positioning in the case of Rakhine and in other areas. But one of the advantage for them is that they are quite aware of the nuances of how the government inside Naypyidaw works, and they try to adapt it. And we should also be reminded that they were once the rent seekers during the time of the military regime, and they also have a hard time transforming themselves to becoming more of a in terms of corporate social responsibility. So I think they also have they're also having a hard time trying to transform themselves, but at the same time they're playing an important role in Myanmar.
Chit Win, Melissa.
Happy to take Trevor's comments as comments generally, but just to note that I acknowledge there are certainly students who are doing things despite the absence of formalised unions, but I'm just very aware that for many students it's an exercise in frustration. In trying, you know, some groups I know who've tried to formalise on relatively apolitical things like sort of career advancement type activities for students. They often have to justify this to their professors, to the university administration, to the Minister of Education, all the way up. And, you know, I think there's just a great loss of the kind of energy, the ideas, the creativity that students could be bringing to the transition process.
Thanks, Melissa. Khin Zaw Win.
Well, thank you for the 3 questions. You know, on the question of the other and othering, you know, well, it's good because I'll be touching on this in the closing panel tomorrow, and there's a bigger event later this year on which I'll be speaking on, so this is good inputs into that, you know. Well, I would say that this is something that exists in all, you know, let's say societies, all countries, you know, and sometimes it's harnessed for the wrong reasons. In Myanmar, well, lots of writers and analysts have said that there's this tendency toward xenophobia in the Burmese people, and that has to be watched. There was a paper some time ago that said the world is going back towards an age of tribes and tribalisms, And since you mentioned what's happening in Europe, elsewhere in the world, this is something that we need to look at more deeply, And it's not just something that is simmering, and unscrupulous politicians make use of it. I think it affects other segments of society as well, even in trade, So I think we have to think about what binds us together, the commonalities, And when you look at what's happening in Myanmar, what our friends have said, youth is one factor. Another thing is land. I was at a land event some weeks ago, and we had people from different ethnicities saying that, is this vacant, fallow, and virgin land law, which the parliament in Myanmar, in its infinite wisdom, amended, on the side of the big, let's say, landholders, all the affluent businesses from Myanmar and from abroad. So there's a lot of sentiment against that, and that was, I found at that event, a unifying factor. And I think the incumbent regime, whether it's the USDP or the NLD, had better watch out. Because I found some very articulate young people from Shan State, Pao, saying that, okay, we have to work on this together. We are suffering. It's not just us, it's the people in the lowlands too. Because this land grabbing, land confiscation, very little reparations given to that. I mean, in a country, a least developed country, which is very agrarian, it hurts people a lot. So that is one factor. The other is youth. So it'll take some time, but we have to work on this. It's not just reading books written by Benedict Anderson. You don't even find that in Myanmar universities, The thing about, things that divide us, the ethnicities, the tribes, we have to find some common ground where we can work together. Right. On the second question, it's about the Kofi Annan report. Yes, it's very unfortunate that the release of the report coincided with the attacks. Up to now, I would say there are two documents which are still valid, which people have to pay a lot of attention to. One is the Kofi Annan report. The other is the report of the International Fact-Finding Mission. The Myanmar Army came up with its own mechanism just last week, and I was interviewed on that on Burmese media, and I said that it's not going to be credible. Well, there have been so many, you lose count of all the acronyms in Myanmar, so many investigative mechanisms, so many commissions of inquiry, you don't know which is which. But these two documents stand out. So early on, when the report was released, I said, well, there are 88 recommendations. If the government can really work and implement just a quarter of it, 22, it'll be enough. But now the government is claiming that they've been implementing over 80 of the recommendations. Well, it's up to all of you to try to find out whether these are true or whether it's credible. I feel very sorry for that. But let me say again, I think human rights organizations and organizations abroad will have to give this more attention to, these two documents, and we have to go on from these. Let's call it the gold standard.
Great. Thank you very much, Khin Zaw Win. And finally, Costas Laoutides.
Thanks, Nick, for the question. I think that what I experienced during my field work resonates a lot with Ian Holiday's point about human rights a la carte, so to speak. But I think that, as I said earlier, this is an evolving process, so it does change. There are pockets of groups, like the youth, I did mention that they think differently, they think more progressively. So although Ian's book is a very good snapshot, is static in time, so I do expect that to transform as we move on. But yes, I think that we can talk about the liberal, if you like, veil within this liberal project in Myanmar. Definitely. At least this is what I saw. And a slight addition to Craig's question about the Annan report, what was quite interesting is that we did have the interim report several months before. The attacks happened on the eve of the release of the final report. So more or less we knew, everybody knew what was in the report. So the list, I mean, I don't want to expand here about talking about moral hazards, we don't have the time, but the least we can say is that it was probably very poor judgment in terms of decision making by ARSA to launch these attacks on the eve of the release of the report, which was full on in support of the Rohingya case in Myanmar, in Rakhine.
Great, thanks very much, Costas. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our four panelists.